And he's working with working together there. That's good because the age factor changed up here. I was surprised because I see stuff
Good afternoon, this is Occupy Caitlin. This is day 3 of the Iowa Utilities Board Back-in Pipeline Deliberation. Today we'll continue the county-by-county parcel discussions on those parcels that have their owners have filed objections to the pipeline for one reason or another, and those we discussed. The first county that will be today will be Calhoun County. The IUB board members and their attorneys and other staff are taking their places, so now we'll again try to aim up at the screens to my right when they show maps and things like that. You may not be able to see it very well, but at least sort of get a semblance of what is being discussed.
Iowa Utilities Board is now in session. It's February 10th, 2016, 1 o'clock p.m. We are in the middle of the routes review. Mr. Wright, you may continue.
And from yesterday, as you remember, we ended up right on the county property, and so that's where we're going to start. And the first of those properties were, as we indicated yesterday, we're addressing those properties that either have an objection filed with regard to the property, or the landowner intervened and testified or testified at the hearing. So those are the ones we're addressing. The first one is HCA 44. And what we've done is, as we discovered yesterday, that actually pulling up the county map and looking at it on the county map first really helped in the discussion rather than trying to go to the Exhibit H diagram. So if you look at this, I think the technology desk has pulled that up so you can see where this property is. And it's the farthest one in the northwest corner there, the Murphy. And basically their objection has to do with the terracing and tile that they have done to the property, and it's similar to objections we've received from other landowners. They're just worried about the pipeline coming through and changing the way their tile system works, or not, and maybe not repairing it adequately so it doesn't, the water doesn't flow the way they've kind of constructed it to flow. Are there any questions about that one? The next one is HCA 13. And this is the Dorothy Wilson property, and you can see it on there. Basically, landowner objection primarily to the taking of her land by eminent domain, and she raises some other issues which we've discussed earlier in these deliberations with regard to public convenience and necessity. No questions on that one. We'll go to the next one. HCA 9. And this is the Murphy land again. That was the same as HCA 44, and the same kind of objections with regard to worried about the replacement of the terraces and tiles that they've been put in place so the land drains appropriately, and just worried about repair of those of the tile system. The next property is HCA's 29. And again, the landowner raises some issues with regard to public convenience and necessity that we discussed earlier. And raises issues with regards to the tile. I think that's probably going to be a common theme. It has been a common theme in the hearing. That really there's a concept, kind of a common theme of worried about if you put all the money and expense into tile and these agricultural property, how that will be affected by the pipeline if the permit is granted. The next one is HCA 14.
Did we skip 28? Or did you cover that?
28 did not have an objection. At least I don't show that line. Let me go back and look. At least what what I have in the documents that we prepared, I don't see an objection for that piece of property. We will double check that, look at that.
Yeah, under
And make sure.
my notes, I have Ken Anderson, both testimony and transcript, that might be.
I think that may be another county. So we go to HCA 14. And again, a lot of the issues raised in the objection have to do with the public emergency necessity, possible pipeline leaking, and how will that affect the land, and then what kind of remediation there will be. The next property where there was an objection is HCA 1. And there is some discussion in that objection about the negotiations with code access land agents. And discussion of the land itself and what their purpose is to hold that land for their family and their children, and that they're really going to oppose the pipeline legal department. The next is HCA 2. Again, on this objection, they raised the issue with regard to eminent domain and taking of private property. And again, they discuss the issues with regard to what they've done with regard to their tile, and they're worried about the repair of that tile or the disturbance of that tile system if the pipeline is if the permit is granted and the pipeline is allowed to be constructed.
Mr. Wright, do you have copies of documents if an individual is represented by legal counsel, who that person is? If the answer is no, fine. If the answer is yes, could you just tell us?
Well, we have it for those that were represented at the hearing. But
And that's all I'm looking, I mean, if they've intervened and they've said that this is who they're representing, and you know that,
right, we
tell
have that
me that.
information.
I don't want anything else.
Okay, for just the objections, unless they actually stated in the objection, then we.
Okay, I'm just seeing for the ones that were at the hearing and testified, and know that there was an intervener representing them.
Okay. And I think we already discussed this, but with regard to HCA 2, the Hartwig property, again, they raised some issues with regard to public convenience and necessity and their tiles. And again, for HCA 52, that's again the same objections to the pipeline. The next property is HCA 62. And again, this objection is first of all to the use of eminent domain for the taking of private property. And there's some discussion there of negotiations with code access.
Can we bring up the specific each file parcel, because I think this one also has a file easement.
You look at Exhibit H then.
does say, yeah, valve.
Right. They did not raise an issue specifically with regard to valve, but there is the valve, and that if we were to grant the permit and grant eminent domain, they would have to grant the right to put the valve in also.
And you said in general.
Eminent domain.
Okay, so they didn't mention, tile.
A little bit, but tile and.
Did they have any specific tile situations that were?
There's no detail about their tile system.
Thanks.
The next would be HCA 34. And as some of the previous objections, these objections go to some of the convenience and necessity issues we discussed earlier in the week with regard to any economic benefits or any real benefits from the pipeline. The next parcel is HCA 16. And basically this objection again just opposes the pipeline on for the same reasons as we discussed in the earlier property. And then we have HCA 41.
I believe this is the one that I mentioned earlier that Ken Anderson had testimony on.
Correct, this is the one that Ken Anderson had testimony on. And I think one of their major questions was, they said the pipeline as where the route is would shut off either a neighbor or someone from a well would be on one side of the pipeline, and the person using the water is on the other side of the pipeline. And I was just looking to see if you remember, the chair asked each of these landowners who testified what their specific remedy was. And I've tried to detail that, and I just double checked that there wasn't something else this property owner raised.
Did the chair happen to ask where the well was located?
I don't find that in specifically, I think the testimony was it'd be on one side with the person that needed access to water, be on the other side of the pipeline.
That would have been a good question to ask.
Well, that must have been at hearing, because I don't see anything mentioned in his testimony, in the pre-file testimony.
Correct.
Mentioning a well, so that must have been.
And Mr. Prey cross-examined or presented the witness, so.
But did he do that because I asked him to do that, or is he representing this person?
Let me just double check.
It doesn't matter that much. It's fine.
Yeah, it appears that he is
Actually,
representing
that
this
would
person.
matter.
Okay, then we go to Cherokee County. And the first parcel there is HCH7. And again, this is one of the objections that kind of goes through a discussion of the various public convenience and necessity issues that you addressed earlier. And they also raise the issue of access to the easement over the remaining part of the property, which is, as we discussed, is an issue with regard to the actual easement language. If the board were to grant this permit and then grant eminent domain. The next is HCH 11. And this again is just an objection to the pipeline itself, without any, doesn't appear to have any specific information regarding the property or the parcel. Next is HCH 21. And this again, the objection states the opposition to the pipeline, but also raises the additional issue of that the pipeline will reduce the value of the property. And then we go to HCH, and I think if you pull that up, there are four pieces of property. And I don't know if you remember Mr. Smith's testimony, but it was rather extensive with regard to the issues he had with regard to the location of the pipeline over these pieces of property. And if you look at this, and I'm not going to go into all the detail that he presented, but I think the two items that kind of stand out is Mr. Smith wanted the pipeline to be moved on the CH15, which is the IACH 80 on the overall map, to have it moved closer to the southwest corner, and then for what is IACH 82, he wanted the pipeline moved more onto that piece, on that parcel, so that it was not located on ICH 83 at all. So it's kind of the two ends of the pipeline are his basic concerns. He had some other concerns about kind of the location, but those are really the two, if you remember the testimony. And he was, with regard to the pipeline located on what shows on their ICH 80, he was even said they could have all of their temporary easement on the north side of that if they would just move it further to the south in that corner. And when we get back and go through this, we can work through each. That's generally what his testimony was.
Back to the route review. If staff look at a route, do they ever, other than corner clips, I mean, we were well educated on corner clips, But other than that, do they look at whether it can run in other directions? I mean, do they look at whether they see, when doing this, either the actual route review or the desktop route review, do they look at where other alternatives could be?
Well, their first concern is where the route is and whether there are any issues with regard to the proposed, route itself. And I think if a landowner raises objections and suggests a move, the board staff that was reviewing this could look at that. I don't know if they did in this instance. There were so many, parcels which had not signed voluntary easements that I think just looking at the route, proposed route itself to make sure there weren't any issues with the route itself took up, most of their time while they were out looking.
I think all three board members understand the complexity of this petition and what we're being asked to look for. So I'm not questioning whether something was or was not done. I'm more interested on whether it was done.
If you look at their reports, I think they addressed 2 or 3 or maybe 4 of those objections, but like with this one in particular, I don't remember that was addressed in the report.
Okay.
Can we look at the southernmost property? I think it's 83. Yeah. Yeah. 85 was not very fair. Can you, yeah, I think that's possible. Yeah, can you go look at up to the right-hand corner a little bit to see the scale? Yeah, go ahead.
Do we have a map that identifies every parcel that received notice? Like a red, so that it's color coded to tell us who all received notice?
We would have to look. I know that we have all of the landowners who were notified, but we may have a corridor map that shows where those landowner parcels are lit.
That's what I wanna know, is if we have so the appropriate language and request is, I'd like to know if there's a corridor map that can be highlighted showing us all of the parcels that received notice.
We'll have to look at, it would be back, with the information with regard to the informational meeting. Okay. Okay.
Well, I guess the chair's point, because I never really thought about it, I just assumed that any of the white outline properties were properties where there is a voluntary easement, or at one point was an involuntary. Is that the correct assessment of this map, do you think?
And I don't know, we could go back and look, but the properties that are in white that the pipeline crosses have voluntary easements.
Right, but so for example, the property that is directly southeast of CH 083, that doesn't have a pipeline going across it. It appears it's a separate parcel from the one that's north and east of it. Would that mean that it has a voluntary easement? Or that it was notified, or what's the significance of that piece of property being identified?
And I don't know that we have that information in the record, but in looking at the map, it appears either Dakota Access got a voluntary easement from that landowner, anticipating that maybe the route would be moved, or that for some reason they decided that it needed to be shown on the map. It's very likely they had a voluntary easement with that, an option in case the route itself had to be moved down and maybe flip that corner or
Right.
that person's property.
So in the case of the 660-foot rule, let's say that small square where the hand is on, all of a sudden comes in play. I don't know what the dimensions are, but just say it has to move. If they haven't been noticed, how does that impact the 660-foot rule?
Well, if they haven't been noticed, then they can't go there without giving notice and going back through the process. So, but if you look at this, I would say it's very likely they did receive notice. And from it being on the map, they probably have had discussions with them. So there may even be either an option or a voluntary easement over that property.
Because to clarify the original process that potentially Dakota Access took, probably cut a broader swath in case, as they were looking at the different routes, I'm trying to remember what the testimony was on that.
Right, well, yeah, right, they would give notice to a broader, range of parcels than actually is shown where the preferred route is being proposed.
That's what I recall. Thank you. The reason I'm asking is because when I look at the map and we're looking at moving, I wanna know who's been noticed, and I don't know, I can't remember what that criteria is it within, what's the distance from the pipeline? And I'm thinking it'd be just easier for me to be able to look at a map that's maybe colored pink, showing me that a notice was given.
And I think we can go back and do that, and I know we can go back and get the landowners who were given notice and then find those parcels if there's a specific issue, but I think we can find some kind of a map that shows the corridor.
What is the corridor notice requirement? I don't recall.
I don't know if there's a specific requirement.
I thought there was there was a specific distance, there is not?
It would probably vary by project. If you have a short little 2-mile line connecting two plants, then you're not gonna notice very far off either side of that. But if you're looking at something like this, the notice corridor could be wider, so it's gonna be something selected by the applicant.
So the applicant gets to choose how wide that notice corridor is. I thought that was in our rule.
I'm not aware of that.
It may be in the transmission franchise rules. We're talking about the liquid pipeline rules, which don't have as much detail as those electric and franchise rules.
What the rule provides, it's Rule 13.3 in connection with the notice of the public informational meeting, is that the petitioners should design a route corridor to permit minor route deviations beyond the proposed permanent right-of-way width, shall include, as effective, all parties within the desired corridor. So it's up to the pipeline company to decide what is their desired corridor and make that determination. What you may recall, I don't know, it may have been testimony in the case, as to what Dakota Access's desired corridor was. I don't recall that off.
Well, and maybe that's what I'm remembering, because I remember rather distinctly having a conversation with Mr. Mahmood about about this exact topic of if it has to move, and I think one of his responses was, well, we can move it as far as it doesn't get outside of the notice corridor. And I guess at that point, I was assuming that notice corridor was dependent on our rules, but I guess that was
But, yeah, it doesn't appear that the rules have say that it has to be, the exact width. I think as Mr. Lynch indicated, it really depends upon the size of the pipeline and really the company's, review of how broad, how wide they think that corridor should be.
well, then I guess I would request staff, if we can figure out how wide that corridor was.
You want,
I'd appreciate it.
the question is where they gave notice, correct?
Yeah, what was the corridor?
Correct.
Because that comes into play again, if the board chooses to move the route, we have to keep that in mind as well.
Right.
Because we can't move the route outside of a notice corridor either. Right, that was, I think, what I understand to be true from.
Well, you can't move it outside without starting over, so it's not, it probably wouldn't be recommended that you do that. Here we did Jasper County now? HJA4. And this objection raises questions with regard to how the pipeline will affect the future of the property and also the value of the property. And you've got HJA 17.
Well, hold on, before you go there, that one says Department of Transportation. Is that not a state or government entity?
In the 8th, right?
Is that one of the 8 that we? Okay.
Can we have a list of those 8? All right.
Yeah, if you look at the one we're talking about is that little slice of property about.
Yeah, I understand that, but it just caught my eye that says Department of Transportation, and in our discussion, I don't know how many days ago it was or when it was, about the government owned, so that is in one of the 8, I think it was 8 that we said.
Correct.
Our government owned, okay.
Is the process the same for the Department of Transportation? Do they have to, we've received some pleadings on some governmental entities. Do they have to do anything differently? Does the order, how do you handle that?
We don't handle it at all. The Department of Transportation has a standard utility accommodation policy, which it applies to a variety of different kinds of linear infrastructure utilities that want to cross DOT property. As you can imagine, it's hard to build a transmission line or a pipeline without at some point crossing a highway. And they have a standard policy for when they will allow you to construct those facilities along the highway, when they have to cross at a roughly 90-degree angle, who's responsible for any excess road repair costs if that happens. It's all covered in the regulations, basically.
So it is, because I've not noticed until this point, but anywhere it would cross the a roadway that's under
The
the
yellow
jurisdiction of the
line
DOT,
is
the
a
highway
county
DOT.
boundary line.
I don't remember seeing a parcel.
I can only speculate that there's something different about this parcel. It obviously doesn't look like a road right of way, so I don't know why this one is shown as being different.
Okay, I think if you pull that up, do we have that one? Now, I think if you just look at that, it has a valve on it. Okay, next is HJA 17.
You need to back up to HJ 14.
Okay, there was
Yes,
no.
they have. They're represented by Mr. Swinton.
Is that a different Gannon?
Well, it's not the Gannon that testified.
Okay.
And your point,
No, well, he asked if that's a different Gannon.
Mr. Swinton represents Bill Gannon.
Correct.
So why doesn't it say that there's any objection or?
Who was the Dan Gannon?
Right.
What property is Dan Gannon?
The next one down, JA 17, he testified with regard to that property. And we'll have to go back and look at JA 14. But HJ 17, the testimony with regard to that parcel came from Dan Gannon. And that testimony basically is that he opposes the pipeline. And he goes into some of the same detail that we discussed with regards to public convenience and necessity earlier in the deliberations. Then next is HJ 2. And this is the one which I think there was extensive discussion or testimony of at the hearing, the Sandra Feldstein property. And it's the one that it appears that the route was changed after the date for filing testimony by the interveners, and the board learned of the change at the hearing. And so, I don't know, can you pull up, I think the first one? Just pull up one and we'll Because there are two diagrams, in the H file. Right, this is the latest one, which goes along in a parallel to her property line. And then if you pull up the other one, you don't have the other one? Then can you go, this is the one piece of property where I think, even though there's an objection to using Google Earth, can you go to the one where we have, it's in the deliberations folder, there's 3 of them.
Have we identified yet which properties we did use Google Earth drawings? I mean, one was, I know, in Lee County or down, but we used it on a couple cases at least.
You're talking about at the hearing?
At the hearing.
Right, there are 2 or 3 where they actually put into evidence exhibits which were Google Earth, exhibits.
So isn't
Tweedy's
this one of those?
Tweedy's was one, I don't think this was one.
Okay.
And this is the one, this shows you the,
That's hard to
the property,
see,
approximately where the two,
blue line.
proposed routes were. The blue line is the original, and the yellow line is the latest proposed route. Just give you an idea of the difference.
As I recollect, however, for argument, is the red line the property line? That she owns the property also to the south?
Well, if you see where the pipeline is, correct, that little red line there below the yellow line. Right, that's her.
But she owns.
She owns that down to that red line.
No, she owns the other side of
She
it
owns
as
the
well.
other piece too,
That's what I recollect, she testified to,
that she also owns the property below that.
Wasn't there a terracing issue with her use of the land for her?
Well, I think, if I remember correctly, and we'll have to go and get the detail, is, the issue is, with regard to where the proposed line is now, is her expectations to create an organic garden, and that she's afraid that pipeline will affect the fertility or the productivity of the land.
Well, what I recall was that that's a south facing perfect corner, I know, but farm market garden or something like
Correct.
that. And the concern was that in the middle of a cornfield or bean field, yeah, you can farm right over it because it's harvested every year or whatever in the plant. Effectively, ground goes down and there's nothing left. The concern that I believe I remember her raising was that these plants would not be going to the ground, and would she be able to do a perennial, whether it's a blueberry bush or whatever. The farm market stuff was perennials, not, I guess you want to call corn and beans an annual.
It is an annual because you plant new seed every year.
I would like confirmation of this, but she's now represented by, Mr. Craig.
I think she was represented by.
Oh, she was represented before?
I think so. If you look at the transcript, he offered her as a witness. Okay, the next is HJA 19. it'd be 18 and 19, sorry. And they're both, owned by the same, revocable trust. And they presented, testimony from witnesses that addressed the public convenience necessity and some of the other issues that we've, addressed earlier. I looked and I did not see where they, as we discussed before, proposed an alternative. I think their basic testimony is they're opposed to, testimony filed, they're opposed to the pipeline. There is on 19, there is a valve.
Mr. Ray, can you show me where, or, could the Technology Bureau identify for us, oh, right there. Here's the railroad.
There's another railroad in Story County, but I don't think there's one in this county, or another.
And they have submitted all their voluntary easement. I thought there was an issue with the railroads. What was that issue?
Well, the issue was that there were some, the way I understood it, there were some locations where they were not complying with the statute that requires an approximate right angle crossing. And I think, if my memory is correct, we're double checking that they have eliminated, they've reached agreement with almost all of those except two.
How do we know what the two are?
They're still on the, overall,
And this is one.
the county map, right?
Are there any different eminent domain procedures related to railroads that the board needs to be aware of?
I think the only real difference is the statutory requirement that the crossing be at approximate right angle. So then the next is HJ 25. And if you remember, there were several objections and testimony filed by several of the Rook family, but only one of them testified. And so basically, I think there was a discussion about, they were worried about the pipeline's effect on waterways on their property, and of course on the tile system itself, and then I think in general they were opposed to the pipeline. Then we go to Jefferson County. I have to go to another vote, just give me And it's designated that there's an objection here for HJE 6. But it does not appear that we have reproduced one, so so we'll have to double check and make sure that there was actually an objection, Carl, and see when we go back to it. So we go to HJE 4.
Just a minute, Mr. Wright.
So I'm looking at objection from Robert C. Hunter. I'm gonna assume it's the same.
So you have that, we
Yeah.
just didn't get it reproduced in mine.
Yeah, in general, just general objection, constitutionally, and outside of 47989. For the public convenience and necessity argument. Yeah, that should not be granted, doesn't extend to a for-profit business.
Now we're on J4. And again, the objections mainly go to the public convenience and necessity issues that we've already discussed. And it goes into some detail on those issues, but as I said, we've already discussed those, and those will be addressed when we go back and talk about the various issues that are involved in public convenience and necessity. Then we go to Keokuk. HKE 14 and 16, and it appears that property owners also own HKE 12, 13, and 20. And I think the objections go to all of the properties along the parcels. And basically, they're opposed to the pipeline. They also raise some questions, of course, about their tile systems and the loss of the value to the property if the pipeline is placed on the property.
Can you scroll back up to the far northwest? Where's that? Is that 14?
Correct, that's 14. The IAKE 001 on the overview map.
Can we look, well, we're not gonna have, maybe, can we look at the Google map for that one?
We'll have to see if the technology bureau can find that.
It was,
14.
01. It's somewhere in there. I think that tells you, I was wondering if that was a road, there was some. Right. I am guessing, see the road in about the middle of the page that sort of veers, or there's a sweeping turn, yeah, that one right there. I think if you stop your hand at the intersection of that, yeah, right there, I think that's the corner of that property.
Just ask. Her mark was not on, but she asked to return to this map.
So it would be further east. So it would be, I think, well, I think what I was looking at, if you go back to the other one, I noticed it was kind of a funky shape, and I wanted to see what was creating that. Right, yeah, off the left, you can see the parcels have that separation. I think that's that road, that sweeping turn.
Doesn't that say it's a state highway? It didn't, if you go back to that Google map, doesn't it look like it has the symbol of the state highway?
Yeah.
It's
Well, don't worry,
identification of a state
6 inches in front of my
highway.
face, I couldn't read it, so.
Maybe I need to go give my glasses.
Okay.
I think that's all. Move to Lee County. BHLA 25. And the landowner filed, what we show is 3 objections. First, she's objecting to the angle that is shows going across her property. And as you can see, that is to cross a highway, and the crossings of highways are subject to the same statutory requirement as crossing railroads. They have to be approximate right angle. She's also raised issues with regard to access to the easement over the rest of her property, which is an issue we discussed prior. And she's also raised an issue with the right of, within the easements of Dakota Access, to assign the easement rights to other parties, which she says takes away some of the control she has over the property. And she filed similar or the same objections with regard to HLE 26. And then we move to HLE 28. And as the board members remember, there's extensive testimony with regard to this property because it's the property of Hugh Tweedy. And Mr. Tweedy did testify at the hearing and filed some, I believe, Google Earth maps to show this property. And if you remember that testimony, I think one of his major concerns was the timber, and his testimony that timber had been there a long time, and he was very concerned about any disruption of his land or his timber by the pipeline. There's also testimony about an organic field that was closed. In cross-examination, it was indicated, and I think Mr. Mahmood may have testified to this later, that Dakota Access has agreed to horizontally directionally drill his property, so they don't have to go through and cut the complete easement through his timber. There is an issue, I think, if you remember, about there are some safety concerns that Dakota Access has, and they feel like they're gonna have to cut
fair number of
I
his
believe,
trees.
if I remember the testimony, a 30-foot wide path over where the directional drilling where the pipeline is for safety concerns, and allow them to view the actual land that's over the pipeline.
And isn't some of that FIMSA required, or one of the federal, didn't Stacy Gerard?
That was a
about that?
testimony that it's recommended. I don't know, I'd have to go back and look and see whether it's an actual requirement from PHMSA, but it's to address the safety concerns. I think so that they have easy access to the pipeline if it were to leak at that location. If the trees are still there, then it would really take them longer to get to the pipe to fix it.
I will have to review as well, but I thought I asked specifically of Mr. Mahmood, if you were told that you could allow those trees to remain, would you, and their real concern, safety or not, was that the safety of the company employees because of the problems that they've had. And I'm not convinced that would be a valid, rational reason if they can leave those trees, but that's what I thought. I'll need to read it.
Right, we'll have to go back and look. I know there was that testimony and that discussion with Mr. Mahmood. I just don't myself remember that being an issue with regard to how much of a path was necessary through the trees. And I'd have to go back and check the testimony. There's more of a safety issue getting to the pipeline in case it leaked or there's a problem with it.
Can we bring up the Google map? And there shouldn't be an issue with this one because he had an exhibit to the Google map, so if we need to go look at his exhibit, then we can do that instead, but. Actually, just not fair to look at because we don't identify his property where it is there.
Do you have the Google map that is an exhibit to his testimony? I know it's in our, can you see if you put that up on the screen and it's black and white, so I don't know how well it would show up. But I think if you go back and look at the overall route map, you'll see that there are voluntary easements on, I think, both sides of Mr. Tweedy's property. And he discussed, about maybe moving the line off of his property altogether.
You may proceed.
I'm just trying to make sure I hadn't missed anything. You wanna go to Lyon County, is that?
I've asked her to pull up, I wanted to go to the river.
The yellow curve is the outline of the eastern end of Iowa. The river falls
So
along.
if they horizontally drill on that property, do they currently have the easement areas to put the drilling equipment?
Well, since they offered, you know, they have voluntary easements on those other properties, so since they offered a horizontally directionally drill, you know, I think it's reasonable to assume that they have obtained the right to place those, facilities that allow them to directionally drill on those other properties.
Okay, thank you.
It would be the similar
You
type
go to
of
Lyon County?
drilling that may be used for horizontal drilling for fracking.
And the objection was filed with regard to this parcel has to do with the safety issues with the pipeline itself. Some of the issues that are discussed on public convenience and necessity.
We're discussing this may be Department of Natural Resources land.
That's one of the 8.
Correct.
So that is, so it is a state government property. That is subject to different rules.
Does the Department of Natural Resources have a similar provision as the DOT?
Not that I'm aware of.
And we
Then
go,
is there a requirement for authorization for eminent domain on the DNR property?
The DNR also
I only
has
ask
to
that
grant permits
some of the state
for
agencies
state
are
parks
saying,
and,
if you approve it, you don't need to do the eminent domain, and then you have
Yeah.
others that are saying
Other-
nothing.
and other properties under its jurisdiction.
Or is this subject to one of the permits that's already out there?
My best guess is that it's subject to one of the permits, that they are seeking a permit from, if that's DNR property, they're seeking a permit from the DNR for that, and that's not.
Would analysis be in the route study? Would there be any documentation on this in the route study? You just missed it?
I don't know, without knowing exactly the nature of that parcel and what's involved there, it's just, there's a lot of things it could be.
And your direction, legal direction to the board on that is?
Gonna take more study.
Okay.
so we go to Mahaska County. the HMA 13. And I think if you remember, Pamela Alexander testified with regard to this property. And the concerns were, first of all, the taking of the property by eminent domain. And I think other than the overall effect of the pipeline on the property itself, just the value of the land. And you remember Mr. Glasbrook appeared, but indicated he did not represent Ms. Anderson, but you did allow him to cross-examine her, to ask her some questions. Then we have HMA 15.
I have a question in regard to, go to the right, please, move the map to the right. See the Beverly J. Abel? And then go back up to, Keokuk. Go to Keokuk 12.
I think these may be two parcels in different counties owned by the same person.
Have you verified these aren't the same people?
No, we'll have to look at that.
It
They
could
appear to
be-
be the same.
Could be same family.
So there needs to be,
So that,
Could
the
be.
objections that we discussed earlier are applied, and not only those several parcels that they had that we discussed earlier, but also this parcel. And with regard to HMA 15, they raised, again, several of the issues that were discussed under public convenience necessity. They raised the issue of the taking of the property by eminent domain. But O'Brien County? And again, to go back just one with regard to Brenda Brink, who testified with regard to the HMA 15, again, that was Mr. Glasbrook appeared, but as he indicated, he did not represent them, but he did appear for at the hearing. So it's HOB 1. This is one of Mr. Murray's clients. And as with the other of Mr. Murray's clients, he has issues with the easement language, which, as you saw in the brief of the Northwest Iowa Landowner Association, there goes rather specific proposals to change that easement language.
We are recollecting that he had some specific location issues. Is that in?
I'll look. I know that he had some specific testimony about the value. He said that the dirt, even though Iowa farmland is valuable, and the dirt on his property was like at the highest value, even higher than the normal Iowa farmland. I don't remember a specific location. Let me look real quick. He does have some testimony about the closeness of the pipeline to some buildings. Building's been there a long time, but he indicates no one's living there at the present time.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, it says, there's a family farm acre just to the north of a piece of shape, I'm assuming that with the building site trees and everything on it. We've been asked several times every year to sell that acreage, and it's my wife's family farm. It's not for sale. It's been there for our kids to build a house someday if they'd like, and they know that. And that's, I mean, if we want to be clear.
The quote from the landowner's testimony at the hearing back in November.
That's all still property.
But at least from reading the testimony, it does not appear that that's the actual parcel over which the pipeline will pass.
And he also said there's a natural gas line that runs parallel to the proposed road access.
Okay, then we go to Polk County. HPO2.
That's an example of a corner clip.
And then, as you can see on the list, there's several objections. Most of them address the same issues, which are issues with regard to public convenience, necessity, and oppose the pipeline. We'll go to Sioux County. You go to HSI 18. And this involves the Double D Land and Investment LLC, represented by Mr. Van Ingen. And basically, the testimony is that they don't necessarily have a problem with granting an easement for the pipeline, but they oppose allowing Dakota Access to place a valve on the pipeline. From the testimony indicates that the property is kept in, I guess, a very pristine and has a certain appearance, and they do not want that valve sitting on their property where you can see the valve from their house or on the property.
Didn't they also argue that they wanted it moved to another, closer to a street line or something?
You know, they also filed a brief that raised that same issue, that it may be in the brief, but I mean, the main issue, at least my memory, is
Yeah, their argument is that that placement would leave a strip of land between the valve. So my question, and they state that that testimony is in the transcript.
Are you looking for the exhibit that he mentioned?
No, I'm trying to find the rest of that language. So they're willing to grant the easement, but not the location of the above ground valve. You were, okay.
and that's the main issue, and he raises that again in the brief that he filed.
To me, in his testimony, he said he filed an exhibit DDH-B, which I think was to illustrate where the valve was in relation to the building.
Asking for the particular exhibit filed by this landowner that does not want
I think I
the
have
valve
the exhibit.
located
It'd
on
be easier, we can put it up
the property.
on the screen that way.
There are two dots.
And so the pipeline, can we move that to show more of the west? So the pipeline would run well, I guess you drew a line between those two dots.
Yeah.
Even if that's where he wanted the proposed change versus
prepared testimony and exhibits because, I think it's because of the weather, Mr. Dinherter didn't come to the hearing.
The proposed valve location would be too close to a building for their liking.
Okay, we'll go to Story County. HST 1. And basically, if you remember, Eric Lashir testified regarding this parcel. And a lot of his testimony involved issues related to public convenience necessity. And then also with regard to the fact that it's going diagonal across his property.
And this one also has a valve easement, is that correct?
And there's also a valve on that, correct? On that parcel. Then we go to HST 2. My notes are referring me back to another parcel.
Mr. Wright, it's okay.
Okay. I think in looking at it, I think the issues raised were the public convenience necessity issues, similar to what we discussed before. You go to HST 30. And as you can see, this is an objection was filed regarding this parcel by the Story County Conservation Commission.
That is an area owned by the county
And just
itself.
the general public convenience and necessity. They talk about the $250,000 surety bond. And about first responders if there's a spill. Same kind of things we discussed, issues we discussed earlier. Go to HST 15. And this objection is just basically to the opposed the pipeline. Go to HST 3. And if you remember, Mr. Leonard testified and basically opposed the pipeline. Then we go to Wapello.
Before you leave Story County, will you go back to the first story 17? Is that, so I'm gonna ask on all these, are they a governmental entity? Is 17 a governmental entity? It says state of Iowa, I'm assuming it is.
Yes.
Okay. Is Committee for Agricultural Development a governmental entity?
We haven't counted it as such.
But it's Iowa State. So why do I bring this up? Nick, how many were we told there were?
9.
Okay, I'm at 10.
8, we're told 8.
I'm at 10. So I would like the list of those that are governmental. Because I think Iowa State University Achievement Foundation is governmental. I believe that Iowa State University Achievement Foundation is, but it is, so does the eminent domain? Okay. So those are not, maybe that's my issue. Those are not included in the state?
So we'll need to look at those to make sure they're not a separate, corporation.
And then I'm pretty sure Board of Regents, State of Iowa would fit. And then I believe the Story County Conservation. Okay, now you can move to Van Buren.
Wapello.
Wapello.
The HWA 16.
Liza.
And this is listed as, Hickenbottom's grandmother farm. Steve Hickenbottom testified. And the testimony, I think, had to do with, the desire to construct a pond and a house on the parcel. And they were concerned that the pipeline would prevent them from constructing the pond. And then basically he wants the pipeline to go on somewhere else and not on his property.
Can you tell us when he testified? Or do it the opposite way. Just tell me where it's at in the transcript. And you don't need to get back to me on that.
I'll find it in the transcript. Webster County. The HW4. And this is, Mr. Fontenay's property.
Did we just simply combine all of those exhibits? Is that why it's just 3? Is that what we did? Because it was obviously.
I think we just, they were late filed, and I think we just did not list all of them.
So you just put them as,
Right. They are in the record, we didn't list them all here. And I think he attached some of them to his brief. And I'm assuming the board remembers most of his testimony with regard to his property, and
yes.
he really would like it to be moved off of his property. And you go to HW26. And his prepared testimony basically addresses the public convenience and necessity issues that we've discussed before. He was represented by Mr. Murray. He had some testimony about pipeline's location to a creek on his property. And again, he doesn't want the pipeline going through his property. Then we go to HWE 14. And this is an objection based on some of the same public convenience issues that we've addressed before. And that's all the ones I have on my list.
Either of the board members have any questions?
And I do have the information with regard to Mr. Hickenbottom, if you want that now, or you want it after the.
Yeah, yes.
His direct testimony is that transcript 3128. And of course, he had some redirect, and the board examination was 3132. Transcript page.
And I continually use that there were 7,000 pages of transcript. Is that correct? How many were there really?
Well, we didn't stop and, do you have the
Aren't
last
they
one,
numbered?
Mr. Lane?
If I'm looking at the last volume, it looks like about 3,500 pages.
If you look at the combined PDF, it's 3,501.
And that's just for the transcript, right?
That's That's just the transcript. That's
And then there's all the pre-filed direct testimony.
Right, that does not include any of the pre-filed.
Or the.
I think when I was originally doing that was when we had the error with the double pages, so it was
Right.
going to the next page, and I just never recalculated.
In other words, our system may have been overwhelmed.
Mr.
with
Wright,
all this
Mr.
stuff.
Lynch, do you have anything?
I think we've been through, all of the issues that we laid out in the, order that set the briefing schedule and the issues. I don't believe there are any other issues that we have that we want to present to the board at this time.
For the information of all of the parties, it is the intent of the board to convene in closed session, and therefore we are going to be reading a statement that we're following according to general counsel, and we will adjourn into closed session, follow the procedures that are set out, which includes a recording of that closed session that will be kept, excuse me?
For 1 year, I believe.
Will be kept for 1 year, and we will then either come back today to speak on what we discussed, or tomorrow at 1, depending on what time. I'm leaning towards, and I'm gonna ask the other 2 board members, just coming back tomorrow. So recessing until 1, but moving into closed session. So with that understanding, and before I read the statement, do you have anything else to come before us right now?
No.
Right, I don't have anything further.
Ms. Jacobs, do you have any questions?
No, I do not.
Mr. Wagner? General Counsel has advised the Iowa Utilities Board that pursuant to Iowa Code Section 21.51C, the board may hold a closed session to discuss with our attorneys matters that are in litigation or are likely to be in litigation. Further, pursuant to Section 21.51F, the board may hold a closed session to discuss the decision to be rendered in a contested case conducted according to the provisions of Chapter 17A if a majority of the board members vote in favor of doing so. Council has also advised that Iowa Code Section 21.51A allows the board to hold a closed session if confidential material is discussed. Confidential materials are part of the recording of this proceeding. I am moving that we hold a closed session pursuant to Sections 21.51A, C, and F. May I have a second?
Second.
Those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The Iowa Utilities Board will now proceed to closed session to discuss the decision to be rendered in this matter along with confidential materials, and we will return to open session to take final action. We will either we are coming back tomorrow at 1 p.m. and at that time we will come out of closed session and make the statements that are required under Iowa law. Seeing nothing further to come before the Iowa Utilities Board, we are moving into closed session.
And with that, I run my stream, so tomorrow morning, 1 p.m. Central, we resume. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the stream.